My wife threatened divorce every time I disagreed, so I gave her exactly what she wanted, plus the silence she claimed to crave so badly. I'm a 32-year-old man, married for 5 years, and I've always believed that a marriage should be a partnership. At least that's what I thought until I realized that even tiny disagreements with my wife could ignite a full-blown emotional storm. The first time I noticed it, we were deciding on where to spend a weekend. Something as trivial as choosing between visiting my family or hers. I suggested we split the time, thinking it was fair. She paused, her eyes narrowing, and said, "If you can't commit to us as a family, maybe this marriage isn't for you." At the time, I laughed nervously, assuming she was joking. But it wasn't a joke. After that, the pattern started. Every small disagreement became a negotiation with an unspoken threat hovering above my head. It was subtle at first, comments about how I wasn't supportive enough or how my opinions were too negative. But soon, her threats escalated. Divorce, leaving me, taking everything, framing me as the one who failed. The anxiety that crept into me wasn't just fear of losing her, it was fear of being wrong in any conversation, fear that a casual opinion could spark the end of everything we had built. I began calculating every word, measuring every tone, and second-guessing even the simplest of decisions. The hardest part was that no one else could see it. Friends and family only saw her smiling, laughing, the perfect wife. At dinner parties, she would be radiant, charming, and generous, and I'd sit quietly, my stomach tight, pretending everything was normal. The contrast between the public and private faces of our marriage made me question my own sanity. Was I exaggerating? Was I overreacting? Or was I finally noticing the truth that I'd been blind to for too long? That night, as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I remembered her words from that first argument. "If you can't commit, maybe this marriage isn't for you." I felt a hollow ache, a gnawing doubt that whispered I was already failing, that any attempt to disagree was a dangerous gamble. And as I listened to her even breathing beside me, soft and steady, I realized that this wasn't going to be a one-time thing. It had only just begun. I didn't know it yet, but this pattern would soon consume every part of my life and push me to the edge. It didn't take long for me to notice how predictable the cycle had become. Every disagreement, no matter how small, ended the same way. Her voice sharp, her words heavy, always dangling that divorce threat like a sword above my head. One night, it was about something ridiculous. What movie to watch? I suggested a comedy I'd been looking forward to, and she froze, a smirk forming as her eyes sharpened. "You know," she said slowly, "if you can't put my preferences first, maybe this marriage isn't really for you." My stomach sank and I felt that familiar hollow knot of fear tighten. I laughed nervously, hoping to diffuse the tension, but she didn't budge. That was when it hit me. I wasn't arguing anymore. I was navigating a minefield, each word potentially triggering a blast. At first, I tried reasoning with her, explaining that compromise was normal, that disagreements were part of every relationship. But she twisted everything. "Compromise?" she scoffed. "You call that compromise? You're just unwilling to bend for me. You don't care about us at all." Friends would ask why I always looked tense, why I never spoke up in conversations. I'd force a smile and say everything was fine, but inside I felt invisible, as if my opinions and feelings didn't matter. It was exhausting, mentally, emotionally, even physically. What made it worse was the subtle psychological manipulation. She would bring up past mistakes, some minor, some long forgotten, painting them as evidence that I was always wrong. She'd say things like, "Remember last year when you did this? I'm still disappointed." Even when I apologized and tried to explain, it never felt enough. Each confrontation left me drained, questioning myself, wondering if I was too sensitive or unreasonable. I started noticing patterns in her behavior outside arguments, too. A passive comment about my friends, a dismissive remark about my family, subtle digs that slowly chipped away at my confidence. And yet, when anyone else saw her, they'd say, "She's amazing, so caring." That's when I realized I wasn't just dealing with a partner, I was navigating a carefully curated performance. And the truth was terrifying. There was no safe place in this marriage, not even in our own home. Every day, the walls seemed to close in tighter, and I began wondering if I'd ever feel free again. By this point, I had started recognizing the pattern almost instinctively. Any opinion I voiced, any suggestion I made, even something as small as what to cook for dinner, could turn into a full-blown argument. It wasn't just about the disagreement itself. It was about control. She had found a way to dominate every conversation, to make me question my own judgment, and I had fallen right into it. I began anticipating her reactions before even speaking, weighing every word like I was diffusing a bomb. My thoughts were no longer my own. They had to pass her invisible filter first. It wasn't just the arguments that hurt. It was the aftermath. I'd lie awake at night replaying each exchange, dissecting every nuance of her tone and expression. My mind became a battlefield. I started doubting myself constantly. Was I too rigid, too sensitive, too stubborn? The self-blame was suffocating, and no matter how many times I tried to rationalize, I always ended up feeling inadequate. Even my friends noticed I'd grown quieter, more reserved, but I couldn't explain why without sounding ridiculous. After all, she seemed perfect to everyone else, and I feared no one would believe me. Then came the little betrayals that stung more than the arguments. She'd dismiss my plans, subtly undermine my decisions, or make comments in front of others that made me appear childish or incapable. One evening, she laughed at something I said in front of her friends, and I could feel my face flush with humiliation. She smiled at me afterward as if nothing had happened, but the damage was done. I realized she didn't just want to win arguments. She wanted me to feel small, to be constantly on edge, and to bend entirely to her will. The fear began creeping into my daily life. Even mundane decisions, what to eat, what to watch, how to spend the weekend, felt like walking a tightrope. I noticed myself shrinking, avoiding eye contact, and suppressing any desire to assert myself. My confidence was eroding bit by bit, and the home that should have been a safe haven had become a minefield. And somewhere deep inside, I knew this couldn't last forever. But I didn't know if I had the strength to escape it. Something had to give, and I feared it might be me breaking completely first. The first real blow-up came over something I never expected, something as simple as planning a vacation. I suggested we visit my parents for a weekend, just a short trip, and her reaction was explosive. Her voice sharpened like a knife. "You can't even think about us first? Maybe this marriage isn't what I thought it was." My chest tightened, my stomach churned, and I could feel the familiar panic rising. I tried to explain, to reason with her, but every word seemed to fuel the fire. "You never listened to me. You don't care about our life." She screamed, and I could hear the finality in her tone. Divorce was no longer a threat in the background. It felt imminent. That night, as I sat alone in the living room after she stormed off, I replayed the argument over and over. How had it escalated so quickly? How had a simple disagreement about a weekend turned into a question of our entire marriage? I felt a mix of anger, fear, and confusion. Part of me wanted to stand my ground, to fight back and explain myself. Another part felt paralyzed, knowing that any resistance could push her further and make her threat a reality. I could feel the emotional weight pressing down on me. I started to notice changes in myself. My appetite disappeared, I barely slept, and every sound of her moving in the house made me flinch. The arguments weren't just words, they were psychological blows, each one chipping away at my confidence and self-worth. I felt trapped in a cycle that I couldn't escape, no matter how much I tried to be careful or compliant. And yet, there was a moment of realization buried beneath the fear. I understood that this wasn't about vacations or chores or movies. It was about control. She wielded divorce as a weapon to dominate, and I was letting her. That night, curled up in the corner of the couch, I made a silent promise to myself. I needed to find a way to survive this, even if it meant playing her game on my terms. I didn't know it yet, but the game was about to change, and I would soon have to confront my lowest point. After that blow-up, I started withdrawing completely. I stopped volunteering opinions, stopped making plans, and even stopped sharing my feelings. It wasn't peace, I realized later, it was survival. Every time I spoke, I risked another explosion, another threat, another emotional punishment. So I became quiet, silent, invisible in my own home. I ate alone in the kitchen, stayed late at work, and avoided eye contact as much as possible. The house felt colder, emptier, and yet I carried the weight of constant tension with me, like a stone pressing down on my chest. She noticed the silence immediately. At first, she complained softly, asking why I wasn't talking to her, calling me distant, cold, uninterested. I'd nod, give short answers, try to appear engaged, but the truth was far different. I was emotionally retreating, hiding from the constant threat of her anger. I started noticing little things about her behavior. The subtle satisfaction she got from seeing me shrink, the way her eyes would flicker with frustration at my quietness. I realized that my silence was becoming a mirror, one that reflected all her manipulations back at her. At the same time, the isolation began to crush me. I would lie awake for hours, replaying every argument, every subtle insult, every hidden jab I had missed before. My mind became a carousel of self-doubt and anxiety. I felt trapped in my own home, haunted by the woman I had loved and trusted. Even when I tried to relax, my body tensed automatically, my nerves on edge, waiting for the next outburst. It was exhausting. Mentally, physically, emotionally, I was running on fumes and yet I couldn't leave. I didn't know how, and then something shifted inside me. The very thing I had been using to survive, my silence, started to feel like a weapon. I realized that if I could control my reactions, if I could stay calm while she flailed, I could flip the power dynamics ever so slightly. I didn't know exactly how yet, but a seed of strategy had been planted in the middle of my despair. A tiny, quiet thought, maybe I didn't have to bend forever. Maybe I could give her what she wanted, and still win in my own way. I thought I was broken, but I was only beginning to see a path forward, and it would change everything. I started giving her exactly what she wanted, at least on the surface. I agreed with her on everything, her plans, her opinions, her decisions. I stopped arguing, stopped questioning, and stopped asserting myself. On the outside, it looked like I had folded completely, like I had surrendered. But inside, I was calculating, observing, and taking notes. Every word she spoke, every reaction she had, every subtle shift in tone, I stored it all. I realized that by giving her the compliance she demanded, I could quietly watch her true nature unfold. At first, it felt relieving. There were no more arguments in the evenings, no shouting, no threats. The house was peaceful in the hollowest sense. I could move around without tiptoeing, without fear of triggering her. But the relief came with an unexpected side effect. I felt numb. I wasn't happy. I was distant, almost like a shadow of myself. Every smile I forced felt fake, every nod a performance. Yet, in that distance, I found clarity. I saw her manipulations for what they were, and I began to understand the game she had been playing for years. I noticed the little ways she tried to regain control. She would test my silence with subtle digs, passive-aggressive comments or questions meant to provoke. And I didn't respond. I just watched. She grew frustrated, her attempts to spark conflict failing repeatedly. It was strangely empowering, though I couldn't admit it even to myself. For the first time, I had a sense of control in a situation that had always made me feel powerless. And yet, the house still felt heavy with unspoken tension. Even while she was temporarily satisfied, I knew that her need for control wouldn't vanish. It would escalate. Something was coming. I could feel it, though I didn't yet know what. I had embraced silence as a shield, but it was also becoming a weapon. And soon, the consequences of my quiet observation would shock both of us. Little did she know. The man she thought was broken was quietly planning his own quiet revenge. Everything changed the night I stumbled onto her messages. I wasn't snooping, at least not consciously. I was just checking something harmless. And there it was. Texts between her and a mutual friend, carefully worded, talking about keeping him in line, and how easy it was to manipulate me into compliance. My chest tightened, my stomach dropped, and suddenly everything clicked. The threats, the ultimatums, the constant emotional manipulations. It wasn't just temper or insecurity. She had been deliberately using divorce as a weapon to control me, to bend every decision, every opinion, every part of my life to her will. I sat there staring at the screen, trying to process the betrayal. Shock gave way to anger, anger to a bitter sense of vindication. I realized now that every time I had complied, every time I had been quiet, I had been proving her tactic worked. My fear, my silence, my obedience, it was exactly what she wanted. And yet, deep down, a strange calm began to settle over me. Because now, I had the evidence. I could see the full picture, and that clarity was a kind of power I hadn't felt in years. The next few days were a careful dance. I continued to comply outwardly, keeping up appearances, but internally I was planning. I analyzed every conversation, every past argument, every subtle jab I had brushed off. I started to see patterns I hadn't noticed before. The triggers, the predictable escalations, the exact moments she tried to make me doubt myself. I began to catalog them mentally, knowing that eventually I could use this knowledge to reclaim some control. But even with this revelation, I was not unscathed. Seeing the deliberate manipulation I had endured for years cut deeper than any argument. I felt anger, betrayal, shame, and a pang of hopelessness that I hadn't expected. Could I survive this without breaking? And if I did, what would happen when I finally confronted her? The thought lingered, chilling me, as I realized that the next move I made would change everything, either my life or what remained of our marriage. I had the truth in my hands, but I knew the real storm was only beginning. With the evidence in front of me, I decided to take a calculated approach. Outwardly, I continued to comply, agreeing to everything she suggested, nodding at every demand and staying silent when she tried to provoke me. But inside, I was no longer the same man who flinched at her every word. I was observing, cataloging, and mentally preparing. Every sigh, every narrowed glance, every half-smile meant something. I realized that the more she tried to push me, the more I could let her expose her own patterns without reacting. Her frustration became palpable almost immediately. She complained about my distance, saying I had become cold and unresponsive. She questioned why I wasn't talking, why I didn't share my thoughts, and why I seemed indifferent. And I didn't answer. I just stayed calm, silent, and measured. Watching her squirm, I noticed the cracks forming in her confident facade. The very tactic she had used against me for years, control through emotional manipulation, was starting to fail. There was a strange sense of empowerment in the quiet. Each failed attempt to provoke me chipped away at her energy, leaving her visibly frustrated and bewildered. For the first time, I felt I had some agency, some control over a situation that had once left me powerless. But I also knew this was delicate. One wrong word, one misstep, and the fragile balance could collapse. The tension in the house was thicker than ever, electric with anticipation, and yet, despite the control I now wielded internally, the emotional toll was undeniable. Nights were still restless, and the fear of a sudden escalation never fully left me. I realized that while silence was my shield and my weapon, it was also a test for both of us. How long could she push before breaking? How long could I hold before snapping? And most importantly, when the inevitable confrontation came, who would truly emerge in control? Every silent day brought us closer to the moment that would finally shatter the game between us. Her attempts to regain control escalated quickly. The complaints turned into lectures, and the lectures became emotional explosions, each one more dramatic than the last. She questioned my every move, criticized how I spent my time, and tried to make me feel guilty for things I hadn't even done. And still, I remained outwardly compliant, nodding, agreeing, giving the illusion of surrender, while silently cataloging every reaction. Every failed attempt to provoke me fed my quiet satisfaction, even as tension thickened in the house like storm clouds before a hurricane. I began replaying our past arguments in my mind, analyzing how she manipulated me, how she weaponized my love and trust against me. It was exhausting, but also clarifying. I could see the predictable triggers now, the exact points where she believed she had power. And the knowledge was intoxicating in a way I hadn't expected. For the first time, I realized I wasn't powerless. I had a strategy, I just had to wait for the perfect moment. Despite my inward empowerment, the emotional strain continued to weigh on me. I felt isolated in my own home, constantly observing her moods, measuring every reaction, and suppressing my own feelings. There were nights I lay awake, heart pounding, knowing that one small mistake could unravel everything. The psychological tug-of-war had reached a new peak, and the house was no longer a safe place. It was a battlefield. But something was changing in her as well. She began noticing that her attempts to provoke me were failing. Frustration crept into her voice, sharp and impatient. I could see it in her eyes. The first glimmer of doubt that maybe she wasn't fully in control anymore. And that doubt was contagious. I felt a quiet thrill at the thought that the manipulator might finally face the consequences of her own tactics. She was starting to realize I wasn't the same man she had always controlled, and the game was about to shift completely. The confrontation began the night I finally decided to speak. I hadn't raised my voice in weeks, hadn't argued or resisted, and she had grown increasingly frustrated by my silence. That evening, she cornered me in the living room, eyes blazing, hands on her hips, demanding to know why I had become so cold. For the first time, I didn't flinch. I met her gaze calmly, letting the silence stretch for a beat before I spoke. "I've been listening," I said softly, "and I understand now what you've been doing." Her mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. "What are you talking about?" she demanded, voice trembling between anger and confusion. I took a deep breath and began recounting her words, her threats, her manipulations, the messages I had found, the patterns I had endured. I described the way she twisted minor disagreements into emotional ultimatums, the way she weaponized divorce as a tool to control me, the countless nights I had lain awake replaying her attacks. She was speechless, her fury giving way to disbelief. I could see her trying to maintain control, but it was slipping. Every denial, every attempt to justify herself, only reinforced my account. I stayed calm, measured, letting her unravel under the weight of her own actions. For the first time, the power had shifted. The man she thought was broken, the man who had been silent and compliant, was finally asserting himself with precision and clarity. And yet, the confrontation wasn't just about proving a point, it was about reclaiming myself. I told her how exhausted, anxious, and manipulated I had felt, how my confidence had been chipped away over time, and how her tactics had left me questioning my own worth. Each word hit like a hammer, each pause allowing her to feel the weight of her own cruelty. I could see tears forming, anger softening, and a dawning understanding in her eyes that the game she had played for so long was over. The storm of years-long manipulation had reached its peak, and what happened next would finally decide who truly held control. I could see her faltering, the confident mask she wore for years cracking with every word I spoke. The house, which had felt like a battlefield for so long, now felt charged with a new energy. Mine. I didn't scream, I didn't beg, I simply laid out the truth. Every threat, every manipulation, every subtle jab was placed under a microscope, and she could no longer hide behind her charm. Her eyes widened as she realized the extent of her actions. The emotional damage she had caused and the control she thought she had over me was gone. For the first time, I felt free to express myself fully. I told her how drained, anxious, and small I had felt, how the constant fear of her reactions had suffocated me, and how I had been walking on eggshells for years. Her usual defenses, denial, anger, blame, started to falter. There was no gaslighting left to do. The truth had been laid bare, and I could see the recognition in her eyes. She was confronted with her own manipulation, and I finally had the upper hand. Then I delivered the part she hadn't anticipated. I didn't need revenge in the traditional sense. I didn't need to hurt her physically or humiliate her publicly. I simply enforced boundaries, reclaimed my space, and refused to engage in any more emotional games. Silence became my ally, not my prison. She realized that the man she had tried to control was no longer at her mercy, and the look on her face, a mix of shock, anger, and reluctant respect, was more satisfying than any dramatic payback I could have imagined. By the end of that evening, The power dynamics had shifted irrevocably. I could feel the tension lift slightly, not because everything was perfect, but because I had taken back control of my life and my emotions. For the first time in years, I felt a flicker of peace, a sense that I could finally navigate this relationship on my own terms. The battle had been long, brutal, and emotionally exhausting, but the payoff, the reclaiming of my voice and agency, was worth every sleepless night I had endured. The house was quiet now, but we both knew nothing would ever be the same, and I was finally ready for what came next. The days after that confrontation were strangely calm, but the calm wasn't empty. It was deliberate. I had learned that peace wasn't about avoiding conflict. It was about reclaiming control over my own mind and emotions. I still lived with her, still shared the same space, but the invisible chains that had bound me for years were gone. I no longer flinched at her words, no longer measured every statement to avoid an outburst. The silence we both once feared had become my armor and my statement. I could exist without fear, without being manipulated, without surrendering my voice. I took time to reflect on everything, the early arguments, the subtle digs, the constant threats, and I realized how much strength it had taken to survive them. I acknowledged my own growth. Patience, observation, and restraint had become tools, not weaknesses, and I understood something crucial. Empowerment doesn't always come from confrontation or revenge. Sometimes it comes from quiet, calculated action, and knowing when to speak and when to remain steadfast. The realization filled me with an unexpected serenity, a sense of self-worth I hadn't felt in years. She, of course, was changed too. I could see her processing what had happened, realizing that the old tactics no longer worked. Her frustration was palpable at times. Her attempts to provoke met with calm resolve instead of panic. Slowly, we both began to adjust, redefining our boundaries, understanding limits we had previously ignored. For the first time, I felt like I could breathe in my own home, like I had space to be myself without fear. And while I don't pretend everything is perfect, manipulation leaves scars, I now know my own value and my own strength. I survived the psychological warfare, endured the emotional games, and emerged with clarity, control, and a renewed sense of self. For the first time in years, I feel empowered rather than trapped, and oddly, I find hope in that. The marriage isn't perfect, but I am no longer powerless, and that alone is victory enough.